It is the 28th of August 1963. On the National Mall in Washington, D.C., the sun beats down on the 250,000 people who stand in anticipation of a speech, soon to become legendary in political history. Martin Luther King Jr. steps up to the podium, surrounded on all sides by activists and leaders of the civil rights movement, and gazes over the crowd, which stretches all the way back to the Washington Monument. He is welcomed with cheers, which soon die away into silence, and he begins his speech, which will be remembered forever by words which will echo through time. I have a dream. Before we begin, a quick word from our sponsors, Babbel, the world's #1 language learning app. Ever wanted to learn a new language, but find the prospect daunting? Then Babbel is a learning tool for you, as it prepares you for real-world conversations you will encounter, whether you're traveling, visiting another country on business, or simply planning a vacation. For example, we've been learning French.
J'adore apprendre le français en utilisant Babbel. C'est incroyable.
Click the link in the video description to sign up today and get 50% off Babbel for 6 months for a limited time only. The man known to history as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born Michael Luther King Jr. on the 15th of January 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. King's father, the Reverend Michael King Sr., grew up in rural Georgia and moved to Georgia's state capital, Atlanta, in 1914, enrolling in Morehouse College aged 27 in 1926, where he trained for the ministry, and joined the Reverend A.D. Williams in the Ebenezer Baptist Church as an assistant pastor, where he would eventually raise the congregation from 600 to several thousand. King's mother was Alberta Christina Williams, the daughter of the aforementioned Reverend A.D. Williams and a native of Atlanta, growing up in Sweet Auburn, one of the city's busiest black neighborhoods, in which the Ebenezer Church was located. Michael and Alberta were married in 1926 and moved into the house of A.D. Williams on Auburn Avenue, and in the 3 years between 1927 and 1930, the couple had 3 children. Martin's older sister, Christine King, born in 1927, Martin, born in 1929, originally christened Michael King Jr., and his younger brother, Alfred Daniel, who was known as A.D. and was born in 1930. In 1931, Michael King Sr. took over as pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church following the death of Alberta's father, the Reverend A.D. Williams, and in 1934 King Sr. was sent on a trip, which included stops in Rome, Tunisia, Egypt, Jerusalem, as well as Berlin, for a meeting of the Baptist World Alliance. And whilst in Berlin at the end of the trip, King Sr. visited sites associated with Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation leader, whilst also witnessing the rise of Nazism. Indeed, this trip had such a profound effect on the pastor that when he returned home in 1934, he began referring to himself as Martin Luther King Sr. and changed the name on his son's birth certificate to Martin Luther King Jr. in 1957, when King Jr. was 28. Martin Luther King Jr. was born into a world rife with racial discrimination, as Georgia, in the American South, was still under the influence of the Jim Crow laws, many of which were not abolished until the mid-1960s, keeping black and white Americans strictly segregated, with blacks discriminated against in many other areas of society, and the attempts by activists to change matters had only a limited influence in the South. For example, the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case, in which the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation was constitutional, provided that the facilities for black citizens were of the same standard as those provided to white citizens. This became known as the separate but equal doctrine, although standards for blacks were rarely, if ever, equal to those provided to whites. As a child, King's best friend was a white boy who lived over the road from his family's house in Atlanta, although when the two came to start school, the The boy's parents informed King Jr. that he could no longer play with their son, as he was black, following which his childhood friend went on to attend an all-white school, and King Jr. never played with him again. But his parents took the opportunity to explain to their son about the history of slavery and discrimination against blacks, whilst also instilling in him the Christian tenet of love thy neighbour as thyself. King was a strong-willed child and had a quick temper, and was known to get into the occasional fistfight. Although he was well-liked, and throughout his youth he found comfort and love from his grandmother, Jenny Williams, who provided solace from his often volatile father, who would subject King to beatings which made tears stream from his eyes, but he would always stand strong. Indeed, King Sr. would set an example to his son of how to stand up against discrimination. Once in a shoe shop with his son, he was told that he had to stand at the back of the store. He refused, saying that he would stand and buy shoes at the front of the store, or he would not buy their shoes. Growing up a devout Christian, King could recite passages from the Bible when aged only 5, developing an early fascination with rhetoric. He also expanded his vocabulary by reading dictionaries, and he reportedly said to his mother, "When I grow up, I'm going to get me some big words." At the age of 13, King Jr. enrolled in the Booker T High School in 1942, which was the only high school for African American students in the city, and had been established following pressure from local black leaders, including King's grandfather. He gained average marks but excelled at public speaking, and one evening, King took part in a debating competition in Dublin, Georgia, winning first prize. But on the bus ride home, he sat alongside his teacher, Mrs. Bradley, and when the bus became overcrowded, the young King and his teacher were ordered by the bus driver to stand in order to let a white man sit down. An incident that King would later write made him the angriest that I've ever been in my life. King graduated from high school in 1944 and enrolled in Morehouse College, his father's alma mater, age 15. Although King didn't have a clear idea as to what he wanted to do following college, he was known for his first-class public speaking abilities and had been part of the school's debating team, although initially he held only a moderate commitment to his studies. But one summer, King worked on a tobacco farm in Connecticut, a northern state which did not maintain segregation, and had his first taste of a more equal society, which instilled in King a want for equality of treatment between citizens. Traveling home, King changed trains in Washington, D.C., and whereas in the north, King had been able to sit anywhere he wished, on the second leg of his journey, King was forced to sit in a blacks-only area of the train, an experience which added to his growing sense of injustice. When coming to choose a career, King was inspired by his grandfather, A.D. Williams, a pastor and a founding member of the Atlanta chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, a civil rights movement originally founded in 1909. He was also inspired by his teacher, Dr. Benjamin Mays of Morehouse College, to become a minister. King's father Michael was overjoyed that his son wished to become a fellow clergyman and invited him to give a practice sermon at the Ebenezer Church, following which the congregation showered him with praise. And so, deciding to pursue theology further, King enrolled in the Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, after graduating from Morehouse in 1948 as one of the very few black students. Over the course of his studies, King became increasingly engaged with the life and works of Mohandas Gandhi, the anti-colonial activist and scholar from India who emphasized non-violence and soul force as a means of fighting an oppressive system, and King was so enraptured with his emphasis on love, tolerance and peace that one evening he went out and bought half a dozen books on Gandhi. King graduated from Crozer in 1951 with the best marks in his year, following which King chose to continue his studies at Boston University, and over the summer, King also preached at the Ebenezer Church. In September, he drove north in his new green Chevrolet to Boston in order to start his PhD, and whilst at Boston, King took courses in philosophy and theology, which he found an enjoyable challenge, and it was during this time that King also met Coretta Scott, who he fell in love with. Coretta was born in 1927 and was a native of Alabama. As a young girl, she studied vocals at the New England Conservatory of Music, But one day in 1952, King called Coretta, arranging to meet her the very next day, and it was at this meeting that King told her that she possessed all the values which he sought in a wife, namely character, intelligence, personality, and beauty. And Coretta was taken aback, replying that it was far too early to talk of marriage, although the two formed a solid connection and continued to meet regularly for long walks together. King continued to mention marriage, which Coretta would brush aside with a laugh, because as a talented singer, she wished to pursue a career in music, and knew that marriage to King would end this aspiration, although one day, when King approached the subject once again, Coretta turned to him and agreed to be his wife. Martin Luther King Sr. gave his blessing for the marriage to go ahead, and so the two were married on the 18th of June, 1953. Toward the end of his PhD course, King was flooded with offers of employment from both Boston University and Morehouse College, and although tempted by the offers, he instead decided to join the ministry. King subsequently applied for the position of pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, giving his first sermon at the church in May 1954, where his eloquent and academic style was very well received. 2 weeks later, the US Supreme Court ruled on the Brown v. Board of Education case, which had been brought to the court to address the matter of segregation in schools, with the court ruling that, as a practice, segregation was unconstitutional, thus ordering the integration of schools across the United States. As a dedicated pastor, King would wake at 5:30 a.m. to write his sermons for the Sunday service, whilst also completing his PhD dissertation, which he submitted in June 1955, earning the title The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and his settled and happy life would become even happier when in November, King and Coretta welcomed their first child, Yolanda. However, 1955 was soon to become turbulent, when on the 1st of December, a black woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man whilst riding the bus home from work, whereupon the bus driver called the police and she was arrested, following which Parks called Edgar Nixon, president of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, who used Parks' treatment as a spark for protest for equal civil rights. One of the first people Nixon called was Martin Luther King Jr., who was one of the most prominent black clergymen in the city by this time, and they convened a meeting the next day, Friday 2nd of December, at which it was decided a boycott of all buses would be called, set for December 5th, with ministers spending the weekend encouraging their congregations to obey the boycott and refuse to take the bus into work. Volunteers worked late into the night, distributing leaflets and pamphlets, although on the morning of the 5th, King woke with a great concern that the boycott would fail, for fear of retribution from organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, as well as the practical matter of how people would get to work, reasons that could potentially destroy all possibility of a boycott. King pulled back the curtains of his living room to see silent bus stops and empty buses rolling past his house. The boycott, despite all his fears, had been a success, and so, in light of this, the same evening a meeting was convened, and the Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA, was formed, which decided that the boycott should be continued until the bus companies employed black drivers, allowed black seating to be protected, and ended the abuse of black passengers. The protesters were encouraged by King to remain peaceful and to endure the abuse levelled against them without responding in kind, and so the boycott continued, and concerned city administrators tried their hardest to force an end to the movement, attempting to arrest taxi drivers for offering protesters lower fares, the same price as a bus ticket for wherever they needed to go in the city, but King responded and circumvented the city's ploy by organising a carpool. In February 1956, King was to suffer a far more violent retribution when his house was bombed, and although Coretta, baby Yolanda, and King were all unharmed, his home had suffered significant damage. In response to this, black protesters gathered outside King's home with torches and bottles. Some even had guns, following which King stood upon his splintered porch and raised his hand for silence, ordering those gathered to lower their weapons, and speaking passionately to the crowd, he re-emphasized the virtue of peaceful protest, telling those gathered there, quote, "We must meet hate with love." news of King's actions had reached far and wide and led to the Fellowship of Reconciliation, or the FOR, a British organisation based in New York, which was committed to civil disobedience as a form of protest, sending a representative, Glenn Smiley, to meet with the MIA in Montgomery. Smiley taught protesters the tactics of civil disobedience, or how to apply peaceful pressure to state systems, and how to cope when attacked, arrested, spat at, or insulted. But the police continued to harass protesters and arrested those in carpools for minor speeding and parking offences, with King himself arrested by the police for driving at 30 miles per hour in a 25 mile per hour zone. Although the boycott continued undeterred, and Montgomery authorities were unable to bring it to an end. On the 4th of February 1955, the MIA decided to take the case of 4 black women to a US district court, which differed from state courts in that they ruled on violations of federal and not state law, and thus had a better chance of backing the pleas of black citizens in the South. The 4 women had been discriminated against on buses, and the MIA wished to use their plight to force a legal end to segregation on public transport, knowing that if the case got to the US Supreme Court, it could end the practice nationwide. In fear, Montgomery authorities arrested King and his associates on a charge of violating an antiquated law against boycotts, leading to his trial in a state court, which found him guilty, fining him $1,000, although the case backfired when news of King's arrest reached national newspapers, and the MIA received nationwide donations amounting to over $200,000, after which all charges were dropped. On the 20th of December 1956, the Supreme Court ruled on the MIA's case, banning segregation on buses and public transportation across the US, and 381 days after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, segregation had been ruled unconstitutional, which was a massive win for King and the MIA, which demonstrated the power of sustained, peaceful, non-violent civil disobedience. The Montgomery boycott had inspired many others, notably in Birmingham and Mobile, Alabama, and Tallahassee in Florida, and King believed that these movements could be unified around a wider platform of civil rights and called a meeting in January 1957 to coordinate their efforts. During the conference, King's aide and close friend, Ralph Abernathy, got a call to say that his church had been bombed, as one of many attacks leveled at black churches following the Supreme Court ruling, performed in part by the white supremacist organization, the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, who burned crosses and organized arson attacks against stores and churches in retaliation against the peaceful protests of the MIA. When they learned of the attack, Abernathy and King left Atlanta and headed back to Montgomery, although they made sure to call another meeting in New Orleans before their departure. This second meeting in the Louisiana city of New Orleans led to the establishment of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, or SCLC, with King elected president and Abernathy elected treasurer. The first move of the SCLC was to contact President Eisenhower and ask him to use his power to enforce the Brown v. Board of Education ruling against segregation in schools, which remained largely ignored in many areas of the South, and although the SCLC wrote to the White House twice, they were ignored on both occasions. Following this rebuff from Eisenhower, the SCLC were invited to a joint NAACP and trade union-led prayer pilgrimage for freedom, which was organized by A. Phillips Randolph and Roy Wilkins, to which King agreed, and the SCLC joined the movement, planning to march on Washington, D.C. on May 17, 1957. This date selected as it marked the anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education case 3 years earlier. On the 17th of May, 20,000 people showed up at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. and gathered before the Lincoln Memorial for a day filled with music and speeches, with King proving to be the star of the show. He used his speech to plead with the federal government to uphold the 15th Amendment, passed in 1869, to give black citizens the right to vote, as it was being violated by southern state governments, who introduced ID checks and tests designed to disenfranchise black voters. Following the pilgrimage, Vice President Richard Nixon agreed to meet with King, and although the meeting had no direct effect, it demonstrated that through organization and peaceful protest, the SCLC and the wider civil rights movement could appeal to the highest authorities in the land. Following his speech at the Lincoln Memorial, King was in demand to give speeches all over the US, which he did in order to raise funds for the SCLC, meaning he was seldom at home after mid-1957, leaving Coretta to raise their children, now including baby Martin III, born the same year in October. During this time, King did find time to write his first book, entitled Stride Toward Freedom, The Montgomery Story, which was published by Stanley Levison, an early white supporter of the civil rights movement. And following the publication of his book, King embarked on a book tour designed to raise funds for the civil rights movement. However, in 1958, when in Harlem, New York, he was stabbed by a black woman, Isola Curry, who approached him at his signing table, asking, "Are you Martin Luther King?" When he replied yes, she plunged a steel letter opener into his chest. King was rushed to hospital, and Curry was detained and later declared criminally insane and transferred to a secure mental hospital. But mercifully, King survived, although this was only the first of many brushes with death he suffered. In 1959, when approached by a charitable organization who offered to pay for him to visit India, King Jr. and Coretta embarked on a month-long trip to the country, meeting with Prime Minister Nehru, who had been a close friend of Gandhi, and whilst there, he placed a wreath at the tomb of his hero, who was seen as the very heart of the non-violence movement, and was now widely championed by civil rights activists in the US. Upon his return to the US later in 1959, King was informed that the SCLC was almost bankrupt, leading him to immediately undertake a speaking tour to raise emergency funds, with the realization that without his direct leadership, the SCLC would be unable to flourish. In November 1959, he resigned from the Dexter Avenue Church as pastor, knowing that his focus should be the SCLC and the championing of civil rights, stating in his last sermon as pastor that history has thrust upon me a responsibility from which I cannot turn away. In early 1960, King moved back to Atlanta, Georgia, and took up residence near his father's church, the Ebenezer Baptist Church. This same year saw a presidential election fought between Richard Nixon for the Republicans and John F. Kennedy, better known as JFK, for the Democrats. Many black voters, including King's father, Martin Sr., supported the Republicans, the party of Abraham Lincoln, who famously stood against the persecution of blacks with the introduction of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, designed to outlaw slavery in the US. King remained undecided, however, as, whilst Eisenhower had backed integration following the Brown v. Board of Education ruling in 1954, and had even sent in the US Army to protect black students entering schools for the first time when they were attacked, King worried that he had done this on a legal rather than a moral basis, and was somewhat more inclined to favour Kennedy. JFK, as a presidential candidate, requested a meeting with King in mid-1960, to which King agreed, but informed the Democrat campaign that he would also seek a meeting with Nixon in order to remain balanced between the two parties. Although on learning this, Kennedy's campaign called off the meeting, fearing that it would boost Nixon's already high poll in the black community. On the same day as he had intended to meet Kennedy, King was invited to join a protest by the Student Non-Violent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, known as SNCC, and with the meeting called off, King had no excuse but to join them. The SNCC had planned to hold sit-ins in segregated restaurants, and both expected and wished to be arrested for doing so, knowing that if King, as the de facto leader of the civil rights movement, was arrested with them, their cause would not only gain local, but national, and even international attention. Before we continue, another word from our sponsor, Babbel, the #1 app for language learning. Broaden your horizons when visiting other countries and cultures by using Babbel, the app that gives you quick and easy lessons in bite-sized chunks that are easy to digest. For example, we've been learning French.
Inscrivez-vous aujourd'hui en utilisant le lien ci-dessous et obtenez 50% de réduction pour un temps limité seulement.
Click the link in the video description to sign up today and get 50% off Babbel for 6 months for a limited time only. On the 19th of October 1960, King and several other campaigners travelled to Rich's restaurant in Atlanta, Georgia, and were refused entry. They remained in place, and the police were called, with all protesters, including King, arrested for trespassing. But William Hartsfield, the mayor of Atlanta, one of only a few progressive administrators in the South, was appalled to learn that King had been interned in one of his jail cells, and Hartsfield used his influence to get all charges dropped against the protesters, although the offense King was charged with remained. When caught speeding some weeks later, in 1960, King was arrested again, brought before the Alabama State Court, and charged with 2 offenses, speeding and trespassing, and was sentenced to 4 months hard labor in the state penitentiary without bail, the news of which made Coretta King collapse in tears. Mayor Hartsfield, on learning of this, called Democrat headquarters to try and marshal the Democrats' campaigning power behind efforts to get King released, although JFK declined, fearing that involving himself in a controversial ongoing court case might threaten his election campaign. Instead, John Kennedy telephoned Coretta to express his sympathies at the verdict. Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of JFK and a trained lawyer, was able to help King, which he did when the future Attorney General called the judge presiding over the King case and reminded him that on minor offenses such as these, it was illegal to refuse defendants bail. At this argument, the judge reversed his decision and King was released on bail, and this, coupled with the news that JFK had called Coretta following the initial ruling, gave Kennedy a massive boost in the polls and allowed him to win the presidency on the 8th of November 1960. In 1961, a new movement formed in Georgia and Alabama known as the Freedom Riders, who sought to protest segregation on buses, which continued despite the fact that it was illegal after the 1956 ruling of the Supreme Court, and the Freedom Riders soon attracted a great deal of public attention, much of it highly negative, with many protesters beaten and attacked by white passengers and civilians for sitting wherever they wished on buses. Kennedy, now president, was faced with a predicament. He could either use the power of the federal government to uphold the ruling of the Supreme Court, or leave matters to state governments, knowing that the former, if undertaken, would pose a significant threat to his support in white Southern communities. Robert Kennedy, now a U.S. Attorney General, sent a representative to Montgomery called John Siegenthaler, who called a meeting with John Patterson, the governor of Alabama, and asked him to protect the Freedom Riders from persecution and violence, especially as the actions of protesters were wholly legal, which Patterson refused. The next week, Klansmen of the Ku Klux Klan ambushed Freedom Riders in a bus station in Montgomery, Alabama, leading to a mass brawl, with Siegenthaler arriving in the midst of the battle, being knocked unconscious. This was one of the first incidents in which white citizens joined blacks in fighting against the KKK. On Sunday, the 21st of May, 1961, King flew out to Montgomery to speak in support of the Freedom Riders, who embraced his valued principles of non-violence and civil disobedience, and King spoke at Ralph Abernathy's First Baptist Church, with hundreds gathering in the audience to hear him, whilst outside the church a crowd of a few hundred white supremacists and Klansmen gathered and began to jeer and chant racist abuse at the assembled congregation, following which the minister presiding over the church attempted to drown out the white supremacists by singing hymns, although the opposing group soon turned violent, hurling bottles and bricks through the windows of the church, showering the congregation with broken glass and injuring some. The church, which was run by civil rights leader Ralph Abernathy, was already under the protection of a few U.S. Marshals who had been sent by Attorney General Kennedy in the wake of the Freedom Rider attacks, with 12 Marshals already standing guard, although faced with an ever-growing crowd of white supremacists, they were forced to call for backup. More Marshals arrived, and in an ill-planned move, they released tear gas to try and break up the group, which, whilst initially effective, blew back into the church and forced some of those inside to leave for fresh air. At the same time, a banging was heard from the back door of the church as white supremacists attempted to break in and attack the assembled congregation, leading King to run into the church's office to telephone Kennedy, and after a short while, silence fell outside. Believing that Kennedy had mobilized the U.S. Army to come to their defense, King went outside, only to find the Alabama National Guard had come to defend the church, and Governor Patterson had indeed mobilized troops to come to their defense. However, the National Guard did little to break up the white supremacist mob, and only acted as a barrier between them and the church. After hours imprisoned in the church, King rang Kennedy again, demanding to know whether there was any justice in the United States, motivating Attorney General Kennedy to furiously ring Governor Patterson and demand that he use the National Guard to break up the mob, who were dispersed at 4:30 a.m. In December 1961, King received an urgent request to speak from Dr. William Anderson, the leader of the Albany Movement, a civil rights group based in Albany, Georgia, who had formed to increase black political engagement and turnout, which gained only limited success, in part due to mass preemptive arrests performed by the city's police department. These arrests had dampened the mood of the movement, and it was hoped that a speech from King would rally demonstrators and breathe a second life into the group. And so, King travelled to